Welcome back to the MSU Deer Labs online seminar series. It is brought to you by the Mississippi State University Extension Service as well as the MSU Forest and Wildlife Research Center. I will be your presenter today. My name is Bronson Strickland, and I want to acknowledge my colleague and the co-director of the MSU Deer Lab, Steve Damaris. As the name implies, this presentation is all about cool season food plots. Want to review everything more or less that we've learned over the past 10 or 15 years. Want to go over the most common forages, their nutrient profiles, which plants work well, which ones work well in mixes, and which ones deer are attracted to. When we're finished with the presentation, my goal is that you are going to feel completely equipped to know what to plant on your property and why. By no means is this every possible thing you could write about or talk about with cool season food plots, but I think it's a really good collection, certainly for people starting out to get you going. Now I want to review some deer preference as measured by photo count. This was a project we did with Jacob Dykes many years ago, and looking at different times of the year, deer are selecting different food plot forages, and we measured this. We measured biomass, we measured quality of the plots, but also we're looking at where the deer is spending time. And so a trail camera placed in each plot and measuring how many photos we get of a deer with their head down foraging. So not including a photo where a deer just walked through, but they had to demonstrate they were foraging in a particular plot. So we're going to look at some of those trends over time. Here are the general results. Again, we're not looking at anything by species, but grouping cereal grains versus clovers. And you might be surprised looking at this graph. I was too initially, but notice that the deer count in the February trial, look at how many more deer we got in absolute number and then relative to clovers that time of year. Notice photo count essentially went to, it wasn't zero, but it was very close. Very little activity at the end of March, and then we start to see an upward tick towards May and then into June. So it may surprise you a little bit, as I just spent time talking about the biomass and quality of the clovers. Why aren't deer spending as much time in those plots in May and June as they were back in February? Well, I think I have an explanation here on the next slide. And I believe the answer is spring green up. So if you look at this bottom graph here, end of March, typically in my region, that is when you're going to see spring green up. So just reviewing what we found in terms of forage biomass, pounds per acre, we have more forage production relative to clovers in February, but we don't have near the forage production in February as we do in May. But we see far more deer photographs in the plots during February. And even though we have this change, this big disparity in quality that's going from February to March into May and June, clover is providing all of this high quality forage. Our clover is now competing with the naturally occurring forages that deer evolved to eat. Might you have a different relationship on your property than what we saw here? Very much so. Very much so. On this property, we also manage the deer habitat very well. So when spring green up comes along, we have very thinned timber, we have used prescribed fire, and we're managing the habitat very well. So I think it's just a really good opportunity just to show you that even with that high quality forage available in these food plots, when the naturally occurring forage is available, we see deer spend a lot of time foraging there and not nearly as much time in our food plots. Now back in February, when the cereal grains were growing, were of good quality, the habitat, the naturally occurring plants just really aren't there that time of year. There's just not much deer forage growing in February. And we see a great amount of utilization in the food plots. Spring greenup occurs. We see in the month of March here, very little utilization at all. And then as we get into late spring and early summer, we see deer back in those clover plots utilizing that forage. So hopefully a really good lesson here for providing habitat as well. And where I started, and I know I've said it over and over and over, so I'm sorry if you're rolling your eyes, but this is just a testament to me of deer are readily going to utilize the habitat that you create. If you provide it, they're going to use it. Just to give you another example of this phenomenon, this was a study conducted many years ago by Bob Griffin and Harry Jacobson, and they were indexing nutritional stress for deer relative to how often deer and how much they were using food plots. And you just notice here the y-axis is utilization, and we just see this decline in May and June and July. And those researchers attributed that to spring greenup, even though they had simultaneously cool season and warm season food plots out there. So deer always had a food plot forage they could go to. They didn't need to, essentially. They were utilizing the naturally occurring forages. So just another example of what is going on the landscape when natural deer food is provided via habitat management, deer are going to respond and use it. Okay, I wanted to include this picture as the beginning of a couple graphs to demonstrate a point I've made several times about staggering your maturity dates for your clovers, just so you can maximize the window of time you're providing forage. We have 3 different clovers here on the tailgate of my truck. That is crimson clover on the left, balansa in the middle, berseem on the right. The date of this photograph is April 15th. And notice we have a continuum of blooming or lack thereof. The crimson clover is early maturing. You see it in full bloom there. The balansa clover is later maturing. We just see one bloom, so it is just beginning in the end of April. And then berseem on the right has yet to even begin to bloom. So blooming is just an indicator of where the plant is relative to its life cycle. After it blooms and flowers, it's going to develop seed. It's an annual plant, and then it's going to die. So this is just kind of showing you these different clovers, how you can use them, add them, blend them to extend that window of forage production. Here's another way to look at this, I guess, graphically. The growth, maturation, and decline of these different forages. Not really a big difference with the cereal grains. It's more about their cold tolerance versus a timing of maturation. But hopefully you get the idea. I think those are more or less interchangeable from the perspective of providing forage during the winter time, during the cold months, and essentially that is what your cereal grains are doing. But with your clovers, we have these different maturation dates, when they peak and when they die. And so I would say having 2 of those would be very advisable if you wanted to extend your window. Crimson is always going to be the earliest maturation, balansa, berseem kind of in the middle, and then we see clovers like arrowleaf and red are typically the latest. So mixing those together can really widen the window. So just one example here, this could be a good mix. having wheat and crimson and arrowleaf, and of course you could also put a brassica in there as well. But that's an example of several different types of cereal grains and clovers you could mix together. And here's another, probably just as good. You could have oats, balança, and red clover. So a lot of different ways. I guess what I would advise is, again, let's always go back to what plants grow best on your property. So hopefully what I've shown you here is you've got several cereal grains and you've got several clover varieties. You have several of the brassicas as well. Experiment on your property, figure out which ones are going to perform the best. And what's really cool now, with all the tools we have available, everybody can be a scientist. Be a scientist on your property. Use an exclusion cage. Measure the amount of production outside and inside. That's going to tell you, number one, in the cage, how well did that forage do in my soil? The difference between inside and outside, how much did the deer like it? You know, is there a really big difference inside and outside? Well, it looks like the deer were very attracted to your food plot. Also utilize trail cameras, another good indicator. Putting cameras on if you wanted to experiment with some different kinds of clover, or you wanted to add a brassica to a mix. Put a clover on that plot and, you know, like we did, count the number of times you see a deer with its head down browsing. So be a scientist on your property and use the tools I've given you, all of these different varieties, mix them together and just determine what works best for you. I also wanted to advise you about other studies. Feel free to look on the internet and look for other studies and publications from Extension University studies, your state wildlife agency. There's a lot of examples of food plot studies that have been done over the years, and maybe, depending on where you are in the US, something a little closer to you, and the values might apply a little bit better. And I will show you one example now. These are some data from a publication. It is freely available on the internet. The name of it is Effective Food Plots for Whitetail Deer in Alabama by Chris Cook and Bill Gray. And you can see that some of the values they found, I would say the trends are similar, but yeah, they found some different values in their soils or the particular year the study was conducted. But you can look at the production of oats, for example, I think is interesting compared to wheat here. But then we also see the decline in oats, kind of as predicted. When it gets really cold, they're going to slow down, not as cold tolerant. We see wheat just keeps on going up. Also, we see crimson clover, and again, it kind of ending here, maturing. Arrowleaf clover still producing on into June, but declining. And then there's a red clover. I would say this is performing about as well as I have seen red clover perform. So very interesting results, and good to look for studies that were done close to where you manage and hunt.